Girl, winter is so last season. And now spring's got you looking at pictures of tank tops with hungry eyes. Your algorithm is feeding you cutoffs. You're thirsty for the sun on your shoulders. That perfect hang on the patio sundress. Those sandals you can wear all day and all night. And you've had enough of shopping from your couch. Done hoping it looks anything like the picture when you tear open that envelope? It's time for a little in-person spring treat. It's time for a trip to Ross. Work your magic.
Hi, Diva. It's Rachel.
And Jordan. Yeah, hi. Quick question.
Why are you not spending your Venmo balance?
Yeah, we're concerned.
You can, buy stuff with it.
Ugh, you love buying stuff.
And earn cash back on eligible purchases.
You love purchasing eligible things.
So the money your friend sent you yesterday, that's today's ramen or rideshare or eye patches.
The skincare kind, not the pyro kind.
Spend with Venmo, then you can earn cash back with Venmo Stash. Venmo Stash bundle terms and exclusions apply. Max $100 cash back per month. See terms at venmo.me/stash terms. ID verification required to use a Venmo balance.
This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson, and look, I'm welcomed back again by the very lovely Matt Lewis. Welcome.
I can't believe you're not sick of me yet.
You know what? I really considered introducing you as the rash that doesn't go away, but I didn't want to insult you right off the bat.
Save that for the end when we're done.
Right. No, I've been really enjoying the series that we're doing on basically medieval monarchs and as we're traveling through time. And I look forward to recording with you every week and can't wait to see what I find out about each of these kings and their families as we go along on the journey. And last week we talked about Edward II. And, well, we didn't quite finish. We ran out of time. And so I'm kind of excited to pick up where we left off, because at the end of the last episode, Edward II had been deposed. He recognized his faults as a king and said, "This is who I am." And I was just, I don't know, that I'm still so touched by that whole thing, that he was willing to recognize that, to see his own faults. But that's kind of where we left off. So where do you want to start?
You might reasonably expect that to be the end of Edward II's story, except that it isn't. Yeah. Because this is the first time we have a deposed King of England living in England. So Edward III's reign officially starts on the 25th of January 1327. He is now the new King of England. His father is from that point onwards referred to in the records as Sir Edward of Carnarvon. So he's still a knight, he's still a sir, and Edward of Carnarvon because he was born at Carnarvon Castle. So he's sort of stripped of all of his royal titles. But this is a bit of an anomaly. Nobody really knows what to do now or how this might work. So I think there's a little bit of kind of cross your fingers, close your eyes, and let's just hope this is okay. And the former Edward II, so we'll call him Sir Edward. Sir Edward is put into the custody initially of his cousin, Henry, Earl of Lancaster, who you might remember from last time is the brother of the Thomas that Edward had executed during his reign. So maybe not the friendliest jailer. But in April of 1327, so after only a few months of this arrangement, Edward is transferred into the joint care of two men, Thomas Lord Berkeley, who strikingly is Roger Mortimer's son-in-law. So Roger Mortimer and Isabella are now sort of running the government for the young Edward. He's still in his mid-teens at this point, considered too young to reign. And also, we talked a bit about last time about the fact that Mortimer is aware of the precarious position that he would be in if Edward II remained on the throne. And I think he's also very well aware of the precarious position he's in now, sort of running the government for Edward III. I guess he must have been wondering if there's anything he can do to make Edward III like him before he takes the reins of power, so that he wasn't going to fall. And I think we can see the fact that he's not sure he can achieve that in that he gives himself the title of the Earl of March. So the Earl of the border region around Wales where his family's power base was. And I think that's Roger Mortimer taking the chance to set his family up dynastically, maybe thinking, you know what, I might not come out of this very well because I've kind of gone too far into this. I'm beyond neck deep and I'm starting to drown in this now. But what I can do is set my family up and hope that, this puts them up to the next stratosphere of government. So we see Sir Edward being put into the custody of Mortimer's son-in-law, Lord Berkeley, and also Sir John Maltravers, who was someone who had been in exile with Mortimer in France as well after he'd escaped from the Tower and left England. So very much two of Mortimer's close personal allies now have custody of Sir Edward. Mm. And the 21st of September 1327. So again, kind of, where are we? 6 months into that arrangement. That's the official date that we're given for Edward's death.
Oh.
We're told that he dies at Berkeley Castle on that date. In between those dates, so in June, Robert the Bruce had invaded the north of England. So he quite likely spied the problems in England as an opportunity for him. He crosses the border, invades the north of England. Roger Mortimer takes an army up to the north. And while he's away, Berkeley Castle, where Sir Edward is being kept, is attacked by two brothers, Thomas and Stephen Dunheved. And their intention is to break Sir Edward out of Berkeley Castle and take him away. So this is starting to ring alarm bells to the government, to Isabella and Mortimer, that Edward's continued presence might be an issue. Yeah. Also in October, in the month after Edward's date of death is given, Roger Mortimer orders the arrest of 26 people in Carnarvon, so the birthplace of King Edward. And they're arrested on charges of plotting to free Edward from Berkeley Castle, even though this is a month after we're told that he's dead. Mm. So we're told he dies on the 21st of September. A report reaches Edward III in London and reaches Parliament to say that the former king, Sir Edward, has passed away. His body is then lying in state at Berkeley Castle until the 20th of October. So like a month, his body is just left at Berkeley Castle on display. We're told that several dignitaries come to view the body, to see it. It's guarded at all times by just one person. But we're also told that by the time all of these dignitaries get there, the body is embalmed to preserve it, to stop it stinking. But that also means that you can't see the body. So there is a Sir Edward-shaped lump of bandages on the table that everyone is being asked to assume is Sir Edward. And I'm being a bit cryptic about this for reasons that will hopefully become clear in a minute. So when his body is laid in state for that month, towards the end of October, it's moved to Gloucester Cathedral, which is the nearest cathedral to Berkeley Castle, really. He's not being brought back to London for a big state burial, so he's not being treated like a former king. He's going to be buried in an out-of-the-way cathedral in the west of England. And although his body gets there at the end of October, it's 2 months later that his funeral actually takes place on the 20th of December. So at that point, he is laid into this tomb that you can go and see today at Gloucester Cathedral. It's absolutely stunning. There's a carved effigy of him on top. It's a beautiful tomb. One of the many reasons to go and visit Gloucester Cathedral. It's a fantastic place if people get the chance to go there. I could list all of the other reasons. Henry III underwent his first coronation there. Robert Curthose, the oldest son of William the Conqueror, is buried there. All sorts of reasons. Bits of Harry Potter were filmed there. Oh. So we have a situation by the end of 1327 in which we're told Edward is dead, his body's been displayed, albeit you can't see his face, and he's been buried in this tomb in Gloucester. And again, you might reasonably expect that to be the end of Edward II's story, but it just isn't. In 1329, we get a guy called Donald, who's the Earl of Mar, a Scottish nobleman, who had been at Edward II's court. He'd been quite friendly with Edward II. And we see him writing letters promising to raise an army and invade England in order to free Sir Edward. And this is 2 years after he's been pronounced dead and buried. Donald, the Earl of Mar, is in Scotland saying, well, I'll go and set him free. Presumably not from the tomb, presumably not to take his corpse back up to Scotland. There seems to be this perception in various quarters that Edward wasn't actually dead. The following year, in 1330, in January of that year, we get a letter written by the Archbishop of York. So not a nobody. William Melton, the Archbishop of York, writes a letter to Simon Swanland, who is the Mayor of London. So you've got the Archbishop of York talking to the Mayor of London. And the Archbishop of York asks the Mayor to secure supplies, lots of travelling requirements and all this sort of stuff, and £200 in gold. And part of the letter, so again, I pulled out a quote for this one. part of the letter that Melton writes, he said, "We have certain news that our liege lord Edward of Carnarvon, we have certain news of our liege lord Edward of Carnarvon that he is alive and in good health of body and in a safe place."
Oh.
So in January 1330, people are trying to raise money and goods because they understand that Edward is still alive and they might want to set him free, presumably at this point to rid themselves of the increasing tyranny of Mortimer. Edward the Second is starting to look preferable to what Mortimer is getting up to. Later in 1330, so a few months after this, we get a situation in which Edmund, the Earl of Kent, who is Edward II's half brother, we mentioned him earlier. He had defected to Mortimer's cause, and went and joined Mortimer and Isabella in France. But in 1330, he's tried in Parliament for attempting to break into Corfe Castle in order to see his brother. So now 3 years or 2.5 years after Edward II was announced to be dead and his funeral had taken place, his half-brother is banging on the door of Corfe Castle saying, "Let me in, I want to see my brother." And it's quite bizarre. We then get a situation, so it's later in 1330, in October that year, that Edward III kind of initiates a bit of a coup at Nottingham Castle to be rid of Mortimer and Isabella and to take the reins of government for himself. So he has Mortimer hanged as a traitor, although interestingly doesn't take away that earldom of March. The family will get that back in the future. So maybe Roger Mortimer's plan worked. You know, he's willing to die the physical death for the dynastic glory that came out of it. But in Edward III's first parliament then, so the very first parliament that sits in of Edward III's kind of majority rule, Lord Berkeley, at whose castle Edward was supposed to have died and who was supposed to have written the letter to London to say, "Whoops, sorry, Edward's died." Bizarrely, in 1330, he stands up in Parliament, and again, I've written a quote here because it's important what he says. He says, "He was never an accomplice, a helper, or a procurer of his death, nor did he ever know of his death until this present Parliament."
What?
So Lord Berkeley is completely denying any knowledge of Edward dying, despite the fact that he had written to Parliament previously and said, "Edward's dead."
What the heck?
So what is going on? It's just bizarre. I mean, is he just trying to get himself out of any charges from Edward III that he killed his dad and he might be looking for retribution and he's desperately trying to get out of it? Or is he putting on record this idea that Edward was never killed, that it never really happened? And all of this continues further into the 1330s. So later in that decade, we get what's known as the Fieschi letter, which is written to Edward III from Italy by a merchant who explains that his father, the former Edward II, is alive and well and living at a monastery in Italy. And he's knocking around, enjoying his life. If we remember, Edward is a man who loves working with the earth, ditching and farming and roofing and all of these kinds of things. Well, now he's living his life out in the Italian countryside at a monastery, working with the monks all day. And this letter says, he's quite happy, actually. He's fine. Just wants you to know he's all right.
He's living his best life.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this a lie? I don't know. It's a weird thing to write to the King of England if it's not true. Yeah. And we can build further on this in 1338. So we're now, 11 years after Edward is supposedly dead and buried. Edward III's financial records, he's on the continent at this point, which is striking. So this is out of England, perhaps a safe space. He's in Koblenz in Germany as part of his efforts to make allies all around there. And his financial records record that he's visited by a man who's noted down as William le Galais, William the Welshman. And he's given money by Edward. And the note that this money is next to records that this man says he's the king's father. And he'd been brought to visit his son while he was out of England by an Italian merchant. So again, an Italian connection in there. So William the Welshman is striking because Edward was born in Wales. So he might not be William, but he could be Edward the Welshman.
Yeah. And
Edward III is willing to entertain this guy who is claiming to be his father, to give him money and put in the records he's having money because he says he's the king's father. And we know then that when Edward III moves on to Antwerp as part of his tour, this William the Welshman, goes with him and spends 3 weeks in the company of Edward III. So Edward III is clearly willing to entertain this guy who, if he's not his dad, it's just having a bit of a laugh, isn't it? It's a bit of a weird, he says he's my dad, we'll take him with us. That's kind of odd. Or is it really his dad coming to visit him from Italy while he's on the continent, while he's out of England, while it's safe, while nobody's going to try and think, we might want to restore Edward II at this point? Was the whole idea that Edward II had been killed and done away with just a cover to ship him off out the country, bury a stuffed bale of straw in a vaguely Edward shape that's all wrapped up like a mummy in bandages and no one will ever know? And actually he goes off and lives perfectly happily in Italy and gets to go and visit his son when his son's on the continent and it's safe. I don't know, but it's bizarre. The things that are happening after Edward is supposed to be dead, people who knew him well, trying to go and see him 3 years after his death and getting executed for it, people trying to break him out from prison after he's dead, people turning up to visit Edward III saying that they're his dad, and Edward's just giving them money and entertaining them for 3 weeks.
Yeah. How odd. Okay, so would Edward III know what his father looked like?
Definitely. I think he would have. He'd known his dad. So the first time they'd really been apart was when Edward goes over to France in 1327 as part of those Isabella kind of falling out with Edward. So he's 15 at that point. So it would be kind of, by the time he sees William the Welshman, it would have been 10 years since he might have seen his dad. But I think, if you were 15 and your dad was an adult, I think 10 years later you'd recognize each other.
Yeah.
I mean, either Edward III is willing to entertain, a bit of a nutter who's turned up claiming to be his dad. And fair play, if this guy's a fraud, he's got some money out of the King of England for it. He's getting paid to say that he's the king's dad. Or Edward is well aware that the idea his father had been killed was just a cover so that people wouldn't look for him, although it doesn't work because people are still believing he's alive after he's dead.
Yeah.
And that his dad can visit him when he's out of England because it's safe. He's not going to be the target of efforts to kind of restore him or rebel against Edward III.
As you were telling the story, it reminded me of a movie I watched one time. I don't remember the name of it, but it was the exact same scenario where Edward was at some, I don't know, abbey somewhere, just living the life and nobody knew who he was.
Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth kind of follows that idea that Edward II is still out there and alive somewhere, but it also, I think, has Edward III not recognizing his dad, which
okay.
I think he probably would in this instance, given that they'd known each other till Edward was 15.
I really like this story. I like the idea that Edward II survived. He escaped. It reminds me again of House of the Dragon and Laenor being allegedly murdered and thrown in the fire, and nobody could tell if it was him or not. And he ran away with his lover, essentially.
Yeah. And I'd also say, I mean, jumping forward, and, everybody knows I'm a Princess in the Tower nutter. The whole idea of the Princes in the Tower having to be murdered is kind of wrapped up in this idea that it begins with Edward II, follows on to Richard II, and also Henry VI, that deposed monarchs have to be killed. But what if that very first example of that wasn't that the deposed monarch has to be killed? It's the deposed monarch has to be got out of the way, kept kind of secretly, and somewhere where they can't be used against the new king. It doesn't mean you have to kill them. Edward III's government haven't necessarily killed his dad. They've dealt with him, because then the whole precedent on which the necessity to murder the princes in the Tower begins to kind of crumble from its very inception. And you don't have to murder every king that's deposed.
That's a great point. Yeah, I like that being the end of Edward II's story. I like the idea of him still living and being free and maybe just not having a care in the world, just tending his garden.
Yeah, and I would also add, if he died in 1327, so this is where we get the red hot poker story, that he was murdered by having a red hot poker shoved up his backside. And the point of that would be that they're going to have to display his body, so you need to kill him in a way that won't leave marks kind of on the bits that people are going to see. I mean, no one's flipping him over and looking there, I presume. That is very much a later addition to the story. So you get later chroniclers talking about the idea that he was killed by a red hot poker to the fundament. And this is partly playing on the stories that he may have been gay or bisexual. So this idea that he was killed in a way that kind of chimes with his sexuality, perhaps. And they also write that, you know, from Berkeley Castle, which is in Gloucestershire, which is not quite on the south coast of England, they write that Edward screamed so loud that people in France could hear him. You know, that's the level of nonsense that they're writing when they say this. I mean, I'm pretty sure you'd scream loudly, but I don't think they'd hear you in France from Gloucestershire. So even if he died in 1327, the red hot poker story is 99.99% certainly false.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I always thought that was such a crazy tale to tell. Like, I would always think, is this some common form of, you know, execution to do this to somebody? But it makes sense if they would have been trying to hide it or whatever. But I'm going to go with the idea that he fled and he survived and lived out the rest of his days getting to be himself.
Yeah. In the absence of definite evidence either way, let's go with the one that doesn't involve people getting murdered.
Yeah, let's do, for a change. Let's do let's do that. Okay, so Edward III, let's just say Edward III now knows his father is alive and safe and that he's not going to be an issue for him. You already said Roger Mortimer is dead. And where does this leave the kingdom now at this point?
So Edward is, by this point, he's about 18. So he's decided he's enough of an adult to rule. Roger Mortimer has been consistently putting Edward down, you know, trying to position himself above Edward, walking in front of him at feast, sitting at a higher seat than him at feast, constantly putting him down. And by the time he's 18, Edward III has decided, I'm not having any more of this. Him and a bunch of his mates use some tunnels underneath Nottingham Castle to kind of sneak in and break into Mortimer's rooms and seize him. They reportedly find Isabella in Mortimer's room, so quite likely to be having a physical relationship by this point. And yeah, so this is his coup, his seizure of power in his own right. But he then finds himself in a kingdom that is in a bit of trouble. You know, Edward II's reign has been disastrous. It has caused problems. It's eroded trust with the nobility. They're very uncertain about the crown. And they're no doubt eyeing this son of Edward II through narrowed eyes and thinking, are we going to get more of the same? Are we going to get problems again here? Yeah. The kingdom is also, you know, we spoke a bit about in Edward's reign, they've got the great famine going on. People can't always get food. So there's been these kind of natural disasters earlier in the century, and society is quite slow to get over those things. So you've got a generation now who were deprived of enough food for several years, possibly in their younger years, and they're perhaps dealing with the consequences of that. They're wary of the government because the government didn't do anything to help them out during the Great Famine. They're increasingly cynical about the church because the church is meant to be there to solve those kinds of problems. You know, pray the Great Famine away. Everybody's praying and the Great Famine ain't going away. So they're starting to think, is the church really the intercessor that we believe it to be, that we need it to be, or is it just a bunch of blokes getting very, very rich? Because that's what it's starting to look like. Yeah. So he has all kinds of societal problems going on. I mentioned before that Mortimer had led a campaign against Scotland in 1327. And one of the first things that Edward does, so he seizes power in late 1330. And in 1332, he takes his own campaign up to Scotland. So Roger Mortimer had got defeated in Scotland, and he'd been forced to sign a treaty with the Scots that Edward III, this was another part of the reason they'd kind of fallen out, Edward III felt was embarrassing for England. So in 1332, he gets an army together and he leads a force up there and fights the Battle of Duplin Moor, which is a huge victory for Edward. So this is a huge moment for his kingship, because he's now maybe harking back to his granddad rather than his father. You know, his father, his reign kind of begins early on. The encounter with the Scots that he's remembered for is the Battle of Bannockburn, which goes horribly wrong and Edward loses it and has to run away. here we've got Edward III in his first campaign against the Scots, dealing them a crushing blow. You know, he's starting to look like maybe he might be the king we actually want.
Mm-hmm.
And he maintains these kind of hostilities with France and makes lots of progress until about 1338, when he decides he really wants to focus his efforts on France. And he can't do that if he's distracted by Scotland. So he does arrange a truce at that point with Scotland that will kind of free him up to go and face the problems that are developing in France. But he's able to do that from a position of strength, you know, rather than Mortimer, who's agreed a treaty from a position of having been defeated and needing to get back to London. Edward is doing it from a position of strength. It's much more favourable towards England. So for many of his subjects who've been watching this, they might be thinking, oh, well, this is quite good news. You know, yeah, we haven't conquered Scotland maybe, but it's because we're going to go and focus our efforts somewhere else. And Edward has shown that he can be victorious in war. And during those campaigns too, something that when we get much later into Edward's story, he's famous for having lots of success in France in the 100 Years' War, and largely reorganizing the English army to use longbowmen a lot more. This is a tactic that Edward is picking up from Scotland during his encounters with them there. So their initial success had been because they were using archers in greater numbers. And Edward sees that work, finds out a way to counter it, but thinks, do you know what? If that worked against us, it just might work against other people as well. So I think he's showing himself to be quite a smart operator. He's willing to change his tactics. He's willing to evolve. He's willing to develop. He's willing to learn from his enemies. He can see what they're doing well, and he can take that on board to improve what he's doing too. So this is all looking incredibly positive in the early years of Edward's reign. And I mentioned before that, you know, he has this issue of inheriting a realm in which the nobles are kind of really wary of the crown. They don't trust the king.
With Plan B emergency contraception, we're in control of our future. It's backup birth control you take after unprotected sex that helps prevent pregnancy before it starts. It works by temporarily delaying ovulation, and it won't impact your future fertility. Plan B is available in all 50 U.S. states at all major retailers near you, with no ID, prescription, or age requirement needed. Together, we've got this. Follow Plan B on Insta at Plan B One Step to learn more. Use as directed.
And Edward is a really interesting character. He goes about fixing this. And I think he's one of the interesting people. He's a lot like Henry V later on in this, I think, in that Edward shows himself willing to trust his nobility until they give him reason not to. Mm. So, you know, you start with a pass, and it's up to you to turn that into a fail. Yeah. Which is, you know, in stark contrast to many other monarchs, particularly like his father, who had eyed a lot of his nobility with real suspicion, had been really wary of their motives, and had not trusted them, and sometimes felt like he preemptively had to move against his nobility. Edward is kind of willing to take a step back and say that didn't work. You know, again, he's willing to learn from the lessons of the recent past. That didn't work for my dad. I need to do something differently. So he, in 1337, so the year before he makes that peace with Scotland, and I think at this point he's beginning to turn his mind to France a little bit. In 1337, he creates 6 new earls, and he also creates 61 new barons. You know, so he's completely restocking the ranks of the nobility and the barons. So we get a Hugh Dudley is made Earl of Gloucester. The De Bowens become Earl of Northampton. We get an Earl of Nottingham, an Earl of Derby. This is where the Montague family become Earls of Salisbury, and we get an Earl of Suffolk as well. And then kind of 61 others of ranks lower than an Earl. And this is very clearly him saying, "This is how I'm going to rule. I'm going to rule with you. You know, I want to bring you along with me. It's up to you if you want to come with me. If you come with me, this works. We all get rich and we do incredibly well and we're famous for all eternity. Yeah. If you want to work against me, then, you know, you might find out what happens if you do that." But I think it's a really interesting way of doing things, and striking that we see kings who are often considered successful, good kings like Edward III and Henry V are the ones who are willing to trust their nobility in the first instance. So their instinct, or at least their first move, is to offer trust and wait to see how it's repaid.
Did he have someone at his side influencing him at all? Or did he come up with all these ideas on his own?
There's nobody kind of in particular. There's nobody that stands out as a kind of mentor. You know, he could have had Roger Mortimer as a mentor, except that Mortimer turns out to be too selfish and too concerned with what he's up to bother. You know, for me, the Mortimer's route to being able to survive Edward III's reign would have been to begin empowering Edward slowly. You know, take the Earldom of March if you want it, but have an eye to Edward and you know, involve him in rule, train him to rule. But Roger Mortimer seems keener to kind of exclude and embarrass Edward, which was never going to be a long-term win for him. Most of those men who become earls are, some of them were involved in Edward's coup at Nottingham. You know, they're his close friends. They're similar in age to him. And it's clear to me that I think he's trying to build this sense of brotherhood in England. You know, this is the man who will later on develop the Order of the Garter. Yeah. So that system that still exists today. And man, I probably said this to you before. I want to be a member of the Order of the Garter so badly. It will never ever happen. Never ever happen. There's no reason it would happen. But I think it might be the coolest thing. To me, it might be the coolest thing you could ever do.
We're going to start a petition.
Do it, please do. Just imagine this guy from Wolverhampton turning up at St George's Chapel.
I would love it.
But yeah, so you know, the Order of the Garter is conceived as this two teams of jousting knights. So two teams of 12. There's 24 in the Order of the Garter at all times. One team led by the king, one team led by his heir, the Prince of Wales, and they have 11 knights kind of to support them either side. So, and it's this real core idea of brotherhood, of bringing everyone close together, of working as a team. And Edward seems really, really keen to instill that and really good at doing it too. He seems to really inspire his men as well. And all of this part of his policy, I think, reaches ahead in kind of 1351. So jumping ahead a little bit, but in 1351, he brings in the treason laws. And this is a statute that sets out very clearly exactly what is, and perhaps more importantly, what isn't treason. Because we had a situation in Edward I's reign where he'd been using treason as kind of a, you know, just a throwaway thing. If I fancy executing you, I'm just going to call you a traitor and I'm going to do it. You know, he's developing the idea of being hanged, drawn and quartered. It's just coming up with new ways to kill people. And it leaves people uncertain what's happening. Edward II's reign had been pretty much the same. You know, there'd been this back and forth ever since Gaveston's execution of what was treason. Was killing someone that the king liked treason? So what Edward does is he strips all of this stuff away. And in an effort to build on that restoration of confidence and certainty, he really narrowly defines what treason is. I think there's only something like 6 things that can be considered treason. And it's stuff like, you know, an attempt on the king's life or assaulting a member of his immediate family. So one of his daughters or the queen or something like that will be considered treason. Colluding with the king's enemies during a time of war will be treason. But nothing else will be. So no longer, Edward is saying, I'm surrendering, I'm giving up the power that my dad and maybe particularly my granddad had been throwing around, this idea that if you annoy me, it's treason and I'm going to execute you. And that these are huge, you know, he's relinquishing an awful lot of power, which isn't a normal thing for kings to be doing, but it's in an effort to say, look, I want to be fair. I want to do this. Like I said before, I want to do this with you. I want you to come with me to do this.
This is just amazing. I feel like already we see like he has seemed to learn from past mistakes, the mistakes that his father and maybe his grandfather made. And now he's starting his reign and he's like, let's do this the right way. Let's have a peaceful reign. Let's all get along. And I think one of the things I want to look at, because you had mentioned France. And in all the episodes that we've been talking about, I feel like France keeps popping up. There's always a Louis who's stirring the pot, causing problems. when it got to the point where he wanted to go to France, so he's got the peace treaty or whatever with Scotland. He's heading over to France. What was the point behind that? What was he trying to do? What was the instigator?
Yeah. So there always is a Louis causing trouble, although by the time we get to this point, we're on to Philip's quite often causing trouble as well. So it's a Louis or a Philip. And the reason that there've been all of these tensions was because if we go all the way back to Henry II and we think about the amount of continental land that he had held, and we talked, when we talked about Henry II, we talked about the King of France didn't like this. It's quite frightening for the King of France to have one person controlling vast swathes of what he wants to be his own kingdom. And England was still hanging on to what's often referred to as Gascony at this point, which is a slightly smaller version of Aquitaine. So down in the southwest of France. And, we talked in the episode last time about Edward II having to go and give homage to the French king for his lands in France, for Gascony. And that kings don't like getting down on their knees in front of other kings, whereas the King of France is loving this. This is a PR coup for him. He's loving it.
He's like, take some pictures. Oh, wait, they're on cameras.
Yeah. Somebody paint this quick. So it's always a bone of contention, this land that the English king has down in France, and there's lots of to and fro about it. So in 1337, so the same year that Edward is creating all of these new earls and all of these kinds of things, and as he's moving towards making peace with France and peace with Scotland and realizing he needs to focus on France, Philip VI, who is king of France at this point, confiscates Gascony from Edward on the charges that Edward had sheltered a man named Robert d'Artois, who was an enemy of Philip. So Robert had fled France. He'd gone to the court of Edward III. Edward III seemed to get on quite well with this guy, made him a counselor, made him a royal counselor and everything else. And Philip is like, I'm really upset about this, but what leverage can I get from it? Oh, you know what I can do? I can use it as an excuse to seize Aquitaine, to take Gascony back. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So whether Philip was really all that annoyed about it or whether it was just a good excuse, I don't know. So Philip VI seizes Gascony and says that no longer belongs to the King of England. Almost certainly expecting Edward to say, hang on, that's my land. What do I have to do to get it back? But Edward III's response to Philip seizing Gascony is to say, fine, I claim your crown. And it's like, it's proper one-upmanship. And Philip must have been like, hang on, what? That is not the game we are playing here.
I'm now the King of France.
Yeah, exactly. I'll have your crown. You can have Gascony. I'll have your crown. And all of this, it really harks back to a debate that had happened previously, kind of before Edward III had attained his majority and everything else. So he'd not really been in a position to get too involved in this. But his mom, so Isabella of France, 3 of her brothers we talked about last time had been kings of France in fairly quick succession. None had had a son that had survived them. So when the last of those brothers, Charles IV, died in 1328, so the year after Mortimer and Isabella's coup in England, he had no son, he had no heir. So then there was a big question about who was going to be King of France next. And really there are 2 options available. One of those is Edward. So his mom is those kings' sister. He's their only living nephew. There is nobody else in that direct line. So to many eyes, I guess, Edward is perhaps the most prominent possibility to take the throne of France. There's obviously a big glaring issue with this, and that's the big awooga that he's already King of England. And the French don't particularly want an Englishman coming over there and being King of France as well. So they start frantically searching around for a way to deal with this. And this is where we get this idea that Salic law kind of barred succession in the female line. By this point, Salic law is about 1,000 years old, and it absolutely does not bar succession in the female line. The French just make it up at this point.
Of course they do.
Yeah, why not? Let's just pretend we've had a law for 1,000 years that says you can't do this. So the only other candidate that they can really find is Philip, who becomes Philip VI. And he is a grandson of Philip III. So Philip III is Isabella's granddad as well. So he's sort of one generation up, but so Philip III's eldest son was Philip IV. His youngest son becomes the Count of Valois, so the House of Valois, and that's where this Philip VI, is descended from. So it's definitely a more obscure line than the one that Edward is in, but Philip's not Philip's not English, so right. That's great.
He's acceptable.
That's what we really want. So shock horror when French nobles are sitting down and saying, do we want the Englishman or the Frenchman to be the next king of France? Surprise, surprise, they settle on the Frenchman. And I think maybe by the time we get to 1337, Philip, it's quite a power move for him to make to seize Gascony on this kind of fairly flimsy charge. And you can't help wondering whether he's a little bit worried about Edward. He will be aware that Edward's claim to the French crown was passed over a little bit in 1328. Edward is showing himself to be militarily very capable in Scotland. He is getting England back behind him. The nobility are falling into line behind him. And maybe to Philip, this is starting to look a little bit more like a threat. And Philip might be thinking, how long till he comes to Gascony and tries to take more territory down in the southwest of France again? So maybe Philip thinks he's doing the smart thing and saying, right, I'll just take the whole lot off you. And it just backfires so spectacularly.
So is this considered the start of the 100 Years' War?
Yeah, so effectively that gets us to the start of the 100 Years' War. There are quite often the first kind of battle of the 100 Years' War is referred to as the Battle of Sluis, which is a naval battle off the coast of the Low Countries in 1340. And this is an overwhelming victory for the English at Sluis. They effectively destroy the entire French fleet. And for decades and decades after this, the French can't rebuild that fleet. And it kind of protects England from the kind of invasion that Philip was planning. Philip was gathering a fleet there with the intention of invading England. And Edward crushes them so completely that they're never able to attempt that ever again. It's the first time that we have a record of cannon being used, artillery being used at sea. So we can see Edward, getting involved in some innovative stuff that's going on around this time as well. And again, he's good at learning how to use this stuff and turn it to his advantage. So that's usually counted as the first real battle of the 100 Years' War. But it's 1337 that Philip is seizing Gascony, and in that same year we do get what's referred to as the Battle of Cadsand, which is a skirmish again at sea off the Flemish coast. That's an English victory. And then the following year we have the Battle of Arnamoudine, which is another naval fight, but this one is a French victory. Arnamoudine is the first one to use artillery. Sorry, my bad. So not Sluis. The French are using artillery against the English and they beat them. So this is where Edward is picking up, again, those tactics that his enemies are using, and something that we'll see later on him putting to good effect on his own account.
He's like a sponge.
The 100 Years' War. Yeah, he is. He seems so very good. When you think about some of the other kings and how utterly inflexible they'd been, here is a guy, exactly as you say, who is like a sponge. He's willing to take the best of everything that everybody is doing to try and improve what he can get up to. He's willing to learn.
Eczema is unpredictable, but you can flare less with Ebglyss, a once-monthly treatment for moderate to severe eczema. After an initial 4-month or longer dosing phase, about 4 in 10 people taking Ebglyss achieved itch relief and clear or almost clear skin at 16 weeks. And most of those people maintain skin that's still more clear at 1 year with monthly dosing.
Ebglyss, lebrikizumab LBKZ, a 250 milligram per 2 milliliter injection, is a prescription medicine used to treat adults and children 12 years of age and older who weigh at least 88 pounds or 40 kilograms with moderate to severe eczema, also called atopic dermatitis, that is not well controlled with prescription therapies used on the skin or topicals, or who cannot use topical therapies. Ebglyss can be used with or without topical corticosteroids. Don't use if you're allergic to Ebglyss. Allergic reactions can occur that can be severe. Eye problems can occur. Tell your doctor if you have new or worsening eye problems. You should not receive a live vaccine when treated with Ebglyss. Before starting Ebglyss, tell your doctor if you have a parasitic infection.
Ask your doctor about Ebglyss and visit ebglyss.lilly.com or call 1-800-LILY-RX or 1-800-545-5979.
Yeah, I'm liking him already. Okay, we haven't even touched on his personal life yet. And I feel like we have to like just kind of talk about that maybe for a little bit, like marriage, children. At this point, does he have sons? What's going on?
So one of the things that Edward does is have an awful lot of children.
Yeah.
He gets married in 1328 to Philippa of Hainault, who is someone that there had been several brides on the cards for him, and if you remember, his dad had been really keen that when he went to France, he didn't allow himself to get married. And one of the things that they'd been constantly dangling was this idea that he was going to marry Philippa of Hainault, just so that Edward II would be like, "No, I told you not to." And probably that was just a threat from Isabella, that she was going to make this happen. But in 1328, so once Edward is officially king, but the kingdom's being run by Mortimer and Isabella, he does marry Philippa of Hainault. Whether he liked her, whether he liked the idea of her, whether there wasn't a better option around at the time, not entirely sure. But again, when we talk about medieval marriages, medieval royal marriages, it's really tricky to talk about whether they loved each other. But what we can say again is they spend enough time in each other's company to have a bucket load of kids. And I think we can describe them as, again, a really good and effective partnership. They work really, really well together, whether that's because they like each other or love each other, or whether that's because they both know their jobs very well, is almost impossible to discern, and kind of almost not really the point. The point is that they do an incredible job of being a king and queen alongside each other. And yeah, they begin to start having children quite early on. So their first son, Edward, who becomes Edward the Black Prince, he's born in 1330. So when Edward III is just 17, so they're quite close in age, and you see them much later on behaving almost like brothers rather than father and son. They're very alike, very similar. They enjoy very similar reputations, and later on, the Black Prince will 100% buy into his dad's war in France and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, then they go on to have several more children, sons that don't survive in between. But famously, they also have Lionel, who will become Duke of Clarence later on. They have then John of Gaunt, who will become the famous Duke of Lancaster. Edmund of Langley, who will become the first Duke of York in the future. And Thomas of Woodstock, who becomes the first Duke of Gloucester. So dukes as well. Duke is a title that Edward III introduces into England. So there are no dukes before his reign. He creates his son, Edward the Black Prince. When he makes him Prince of Wales, he also makes him Duke of Cornwall, which is a position that the heir to the throne sort of still holds today. Prince William is Duke of Cornwall now that his dad's become king, and his dad was Duke of Cornwall before him. And so Edward III was looking around for a way. He's created all of these new earls and everything, but he's looking for a way to distinguish the royal family, the princes, from all of those others. And so he sort of imports this idea of a dukedom from France. So there are dukes of Normandy and Brittany and all of those kinds of places. And so he envisages dukedoms as being this place between the king and an earl, where you can put royal children. So royal sons can become dukes, and they will effectively be on this separate rung of society all by themselves. And alongside that, they have several daughters as well, who make a couple of alliances. There's one very sad story in there around the Black Death as well that we might get to. So they have a very, very successful marriage until later on, I guess we should say.
At this point, it sounds like Edward III can do no wrong.
It does, and we should always be careful, shouldn't we, when we think he's looking too good. And I guess we can bring the Black Death in here as an example of something that is very, very difficult, but maybe Edward doesn't do so well. We can bear in mind that his father had been through that example of the Great Famine and all of the criticism that the government and the church had received for not helping enough, for not dealing with that enough. And Edward is someone who we've seen kind of absorbing all of this stuff. As you've said, he's the sponge, he's learning. He doesn't seem to have learnt anything from that particular episode when he gets to the Black Death. So the Black Death, not called the Black Death at the time, people tended to call it the Pestilence or something like that. As far as science can tell us at the moment, emerges in 1346 in Kyrgyzstan, up in the mountains. There are some very early graves there of a group of people who are described as dying from the pestilence, and these seem to be the first recorded victims that we have so far of the plague. So this is a bacterial pathogen. Yersinia pestis, Y. pestis, is the bug that's causing it. And it's coming out of the east, and it's moving west. Where it emerges places it on the Silk Road, so this big trade route that kind of spans Asia and the Near East and into Europe, where people are moving backwards and forwards, goods are moving all over the place. So perfect kind of conduit for a disease to spread. The idea has often been that it's spread by fleas on the back of rats almost entirely, and perhaps by the time it gets to Europe that's true, but it seems like other rodents were particularly involved in spreading it earlier on, around the steppes in Asia. Gerbils get a bad name in all of this. Apparently gerbils get the blame.
Really? I've never heard that.
I used to have pet gerbils when I was growing
It's a good thing you survived them.
I did. I survived the plague of gerbils. And the plague is believed to have kind of 2, perhaps 3 strains. So there's the bubonic one, which is the most famous one, that is, by the time it gets to Europe, spread by flea bites, and causes those swellings, the buboes on the lymph nodes in the armpits and the groin and things like that, that are the telltale sign of the Black Death. It's also believed to have had a pneumonic strain, so kind of version that you can cough and sneeze out, and that travels on the air and is spread that way. So it's also sometimes suggested that there's a kind of septicemic version of it as well. So a bit like sepsis that you can spread as an infection of the blood too. So this thing is like the perfect storm of a disease. And it ends up entering Europe thanks to the Mongols, who usually I will say good things about the Mongols. I quite like the Mongols. I find them very interesting. But they are laying siege to Kaffa in the Crimea around this time, and some of their army begin to get infected and die from the plague, and they put them onto catapults and catapult them into the city. So very early kind of germ warfare going on. And the city, because it's on a trade route, is full of Genoese traders who, quite rightly, become petrified, flee the city, get in their ships and head back down towards the Mediterranean. But by this point, at least some of them are either carrying the plague, or there are rats and fleas on board their ships that are carrying the plague. So they just carry it straight into Italy. And from there, it spreads all the way across kind of Europe and makes its way into England. And we see kind of the sad moment that I spoke about earlier for Edward in particular, is that in 1348, as the plague is kind of ravaging across England, his daughter Joan, who is often described as his favorite daughter, it's really difficult to actually measure those kind of things. She's been promised in marriage to Peter of Castile, and is traveling off to marry her husband as the plague begins to kind of ravage across Europe. And at the age of 15, she contracts the plague and dies. And we're told that, Edward is left distraught at the loss of his daughter to this. But it's an example of how the plague is one of those things in history that is a great leveler. It does not care if you are rich or poor. It is coming for you.
No.
But Edward's government doesn't do a very good job of dealing with this outbreak. So obviously it's unheard of. We've fairly recently gone through COVID, and we saw governments there scrambling to react. And what is the right thing to do? What is the worst thing that you can do? Who knows? You won't know until it's over whether you've done the right thing or not. And I think quite often people don't give governments enough. I'm not here to defend governments, but it's easy to see these things with hindsight, isn't it?
Yeah.
But here we see someone, we've established Edward as quite a capable guy who knows what he's doing. and his government really struggles to react to the plague. And essentially, it's tearing through England. Where it takes hold, up to 50-60% of populations are dying. There are millions of people across Europe dying. And the thing that Edward's government become obsessed with is all of those pesky people who've survived and now want to get paid more for their labour because there's a labour shortage. Well, that's right. Just not on, is it? I mean, that's just not fair on all of those poor people who own vast estates in the country and now can't get them worked on. I mean, you can't be demanding extra wages for them. That's completely unreasonable. Oh. So one of the very early things that they do is they release this kind of ordinance of labourers, which essentially, this is in June 1349. So this is as the first wave of the plague is still at its height in England. People are dying left, right and centre. Everyone is in a panic. But Edward's government introduces this ordinance of labourers, which effectively caps wages. Because they complain that people, so many people have died that those who've survived are now demanding more wages for their labour. So, you used to pay me a penny for labour, but you can't get anyone else to do it now. So how about you pay me 5 pennies a day?
Yeah.
And in the midst of all of this death and carnage, that's the thing that Edward's government chooses to focus on. And so they cap wages for a whole range of different jobs to essentially pre-pandemic levels. So you can't earn any more than you were on the day that the plague broke out in England. And kind of sheriffs are instructed to spend their time making sure that these people aren't getting paid more than they should, that they're not demanding more wages. Because there was also some of the nobility were willing to pay a little bit more to attract labourers.
Okay.
So the sheriffs were also told to keep an eye on those nobles who were flouting these regulations.
What is going on?
Don't you dare pay those people anymore, even if you want to.
This seems like a big mistake.
It feels like a massive misstep by Edward. But his government kind of doubled down on this. So a couple of years later in 1351, they introduced the Statute of Labourers. So the ordinance had just been something the government had kind of rushed out to get these things sorted as far as they're concerned. 2 years later, they put it into statute, they put it into law through Parliament. And it fixes all of the wages for a whole range of jobs at pre-pandemic levels. And it specifies, if you used to get paid 1 pence a day for this, you can only get paid 1 pence a day for it now. If you previously got paid 2 pence a day, you can't ask for any more than that. We even see kind of 10 years later, so 1361, these laws are extended. So the plague, comes back frequently, but it's also that first outbreak has killed in some places 50% of the population. So you have this smaller group of people who've suddenly inherited land that they might never have expected to have. If you've managed to survive and lots of your family have sadly passed away, you could be acquiring all of their inheritances and properties that you never thought you'd had. And suddenly you've got quite a little portfolio of land, but you're still tied to this tiny bit of land on this nobleman's property, having to work for him as well, and having your wages capped. So there was lots and lots of resistance to this, as you might expect. 10 years later in 1361, those laws are extended, and if they doubled down in 1351, they're tripling down in 1361, because they find out now that lots of serfs, so people who are tied to a piece of land and required to work it, who have inherited other bits of property or who believe that they could earn more money if they went somewhere else, are all fleeing from that bit of land they should be tied to. And guess who this is causing problems for? All those poor rich people who now can't get their land worked on again. So they tighten all of these laws and they crack down to the point where the 1361 law says that if you're caught fleeing from a piece of land without property, you can have an F for falsehood branded onto your forehead.
Oh.
So that everyone knows you tried to run away.
Whoa.
And you didn't get away with it. I mean, this is, for a guy that we've set up as seeming like a pretty good bloke, this might not be what we were looking for from him. And, the Black Death also, as with the famine, it kind of intensifies the focus on the church as not being able to solve these problems. But Edward III has done nothing to promote the idea that the government can deal with this either. He's cracking down on ordinary people for the exclusive benefit of the wealthy minority?
Okay, this might seem like a curveball question, and I don't even know if there's an answer available for this one. But at any point, while the Black Death is raging on the continent, is England being informed that something could be coming? Do they have any idea that, I mean, I think once it gets closer to England, obviously, but is there like any murmurs that they should be preparing?
I think they're aware. I mean, we saw this in the UK with COVID an awful lot, that there is quite often this sense that because we're an island, we're protected from this kind of stuff, which doesn't work if, in COVID you have planes coming over from all over the world, and in the medieval world you've got ships still crossing the channel full of rats and fleas and people who are traveling away from where the plague is. So they know, I think they hear that, particularly in Italy where it hits first, there is complete shock. People are dying all over the place and nobody has a clue what's going on. But as people flee and they take this message with them, they also take the plague with them. So, it just like ripples from a stone dropped in the water, moves out from Italy, kind of east, north and west across Europe. And so I think England probably knew it was coming. The thing is, they wouldn't have understood necessarily what the plague was, how it was transmitted. So what measures you could possibly take to protect against it. They do some things that can seem eventually to be right, which is similar to what the Tudors will do. If you've got land in the country, go to the country, because it's the crowded towns and everybody in close quarters there that allow the thing to spread really, really quickly. But again, the trouble is if you've got a noble household that's moving out of London in a hurry because the plague's there, they're probably taking it with them.
Yeah.
If it's too late, they might be taking it out to the countryside with them as well. So, the plague spreads, it gets to Scotland. So it spreads all the way up through the north of England and into Scotland. And it must have seemed relentless. So they had some warning that it was coming, in that it takes its time to move across from Italy and to spread out further from there. But they don't seem to have been clear what they could do to prevent it getting to England.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And as always, I have to add a little levity to the conversation here, because you talked about England being an island and how things can't reach them. I immediately thought, just like the zombie apocalypse, you guys are safe. If anything happens and there's an outbreak in Europe, they're not coming to England.
Yeah, well, except that we'd probably just fly in a bunch of zombies, wouldn't we?
You
watch that? You watch World War Z, that Brad Pitt film. I haven't read the book, but I've watched the film. He lands in England, and there's still zombies here. Somehow they've got across. I don't know. Knowing our luck, we'd have zombies that can swim the channel.
Probably. Well, I'm wondering if this is a good place for us to stop, because we knew from the get-go, and we didn't let you guys know this, but we knew this was going to be a two-parter because there is just so much to talk about. Is there anything else that we need to add in before we get to part 2 next time?
No, I guess, this is a really nice place to split it, because we've started the 100 Years' War. And imagine telling them in 1337, oh, the start of the 100 Years' War. And then go into what now?
Yeah, exactly. Say what?
But the 100 Years' War has had to be put on pause because of the Black Death. Nobody is fighting while all of this is going on. They're not that crazy.
Right.
Edward isn't dealing very well with it at home, but France is also having to deal with the problems of all of this. So it's kind of put the 100 Years' War on ice for a little while until everybody can work their way through the Black Death and come out the other side of it. So this feels like quite a good place to leave all of that, and maybe come back next time and see how Edward deals with the war in France.
I like that idea. Okay, I just have to say, the first part of this episode, I was Team Edward III. I was all about him. He seemed like a great king, and now I'm starting to waver on this. So I guess we'll have to wait till the next episode to see what my final vote on him is.
Yeah, and that's the thing with some of these characters, isn't it? We shouldn't think about them as being all good or all bad. It's where we can find the nuances in their character. That's where the interest is.
Exactly. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me again. And I realized last episode I didn't give you an opportunity to promote anything. So what do you have coming up? Do you have any talks coming up? What are you working on?
I have got a few talks, which I am absolutely awful at keeping my talk calendar on my website up to date. So apologies to anybody, but yeah, message me on social media and I'll tell you if I'm anywhere near you anytime soon. And yeah, keeping going on the Gone Medieval podcast. That's going from strength to strength. Lots of exciting developments and great episodes coming up with that soon. I'm going to be filming some Anglo-Saxon documentaries about the Heptarchy and England before there was an England over the next couple of months, which I'm really excited about as well.
I just love the topics that you come up with, or somebody comes up with. I don't know who comes up with them, but I am always very excited to see some of the different things that you're talking about, the posts that I see on social media, and just go, I always just saw you as the Wars of the Roses guy, but now I'm seeing you more as just a medieval historian or historian in general. I mean, I think it takes all the same skills to be a historian for other time periods too, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so I used to, I'm going to bore you with a personal story now. My parents always wanted me to be a solicitor, a lawyer when I grew up. So they got me some summer work in a law office in Wolverhampton. And I always remember there was one of the partners there was talking to me, and he was saying, the thing is, no lawyer knows all of the law. The trick is to know which book you need to go and look at to find the bit that you need to know today. And I think history is very much the same, isn't it? No, nobody knows all of history.
Right.
The key is trying to find the stories that you need to tell to get your message across, or the most interesting bit, or the most surprising or unusual bit of it. So it's not about knowing all of history, it's knowing where to go and look to find the right bits of history.
That's great. And that's great advice for anybody who is listening or watching and has an interest in becoming a historian. It really does come down to reading and focusing on a topic or two. That's good.
Absolutely. And just understanding your sources and knowing where to go and look to find out what you need to know.
Yeah. Well, Matt Lewis, thank you so much. I can't wait to see you again next week.
Thank you. Hopefully you'll let me in again.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. This podcast would not be possible without the wonderful and generous support of my Patreon patrons. If you'd like to show your support for the show and help keep it going, head on over to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty to find out the different levels that are available and what you get with each of them. Over on Patreon, if you become a patron, you get early access, commercial-free episodes, exclusive content, and so much more. Also, I have a Substack that I have listening. Until next time.